And as Chief of Accident Reconstruction, what are your typical duties?
Mostly I just teach classes and do administrative paperwork. But what I really love is examining evidence in the field, actually working at my craft.
Do you do all of your work firsthand?
Yes, I do.
Do you rely on any outside sources?
I rely on the in-house lab to take care of some forensic matters for me.
Anyone else?
No.
And how did you become involved in this case today?
The chief of police called me.
And then what did you do?
Objection, Your Honor. This question will lead to hearsay.
Overruled. You may ask.
The chief of police told me that there was an accident and that I should report to the crime scene, which was Hickory Lane. And when I arrived there, I proceeded to begin working.
And when you began working, what did you start doing?
The first thing I did was put up some lights because one of the overhead lights was out, so there was very low visibility. Then I began looking for physical evidence, and there wasn't much. I only found about 3 key pieces of evidence. Found a piece of glass, a paint chip, and a shoe.
Dr. Byrne, do you recognize these pieces?
These are the specimens of evidence I found in the field.
Are they the exact pieces that you collected yourself?
Yes, they are.
At this time, Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to now move what has been previously marked as plaintiff's exhibits 1 and 2 into evidence.
Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. Right now we have no chain of custody as to how this was established, where exactly it came from, and what relevance it has to this particular case. All we know is that this was, it could have been, a cigarette ash that was collected. We don't know how it's relevant in this case. There's been no foundation laid on why this piece of evidence is relevant.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
This is a case that the plaintiffs have brought forth against the defendant about a hit-and-run accident, and Dr. Byrne is the chief accident reconstructionist for the state, and he has testified to his knowledge in that area, and he was also the one who collected those pieces of evidence at the crime scene.
Can you lay a little bit of foundation as to how these pieces of evidence are connected to the, not only the crime, but the case at issue?
Yes.
Gradually it got darker and wider up to the alleged point of impact, where they then degraded into nothing, which would indicate that the car never came to a complete stop.
And you also noted the location of the victim's shoe, and is there any relationship between that and the skid marks?
The relationship there is that the victim's shoe, being in such near proximity to the skid marks, indicates that, well, not so much indicates, but suggests that the victim may have been knocked out of his shoes by the impact from the vehicle.
And how were you able to come to this suggestion?
It's really just a forensic trademark. There's no really scientific basis for it. The shoe could have been left there by any means, but that is a possibility.
Were you able to use the position of the victim on that diagram? Did you use that in your investigation in any way?
No, the victim was no longer there.
And you stated you made another document in this case?
The accident reconstruction.
Permission to approach closing counsel.
You may.
May the record reflect I'm now showing closing counsel as been previously marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 3. You recognize this document?
This is my accident reconstruction report.
And is it a fair and accurate copy?
It is.
At this time, Your Honors, the plaintiff would now like to move what has been previously marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 3 into evidence.
Any objection?
Your Honor, yes we do. There is instances of hearsay of information that is not gathered from him or directly from him, and in fact it is from outside the court, in which they could have easily called someone else to call directly, get this evidence in. Results from other labs, eyewitness statements. This is obviously hearsay and hearsay within hearsay in this document, and therefore this should not be admitted.
May I respond, Your Honor? We laid foundation earlier when the witness was asked what he used in his normal course of business to procure such documents, and he stated that he uses outside the laboratory that the state uses in making his usual crime reports.
Your Honor, if I
But
may.
you are trying to admit this document into evidence,
Yes,
and it contains material that is obtained by this witness from other sources, not from his own deliberations, investigations, and analyses.
correct. The only the only thing that is not directly analyzed by Dr. Braun is a paint chemical analysis, which is done at a lab, which he does not do himself, but
That's
he
the
uses
only
that.
thing in this report that isn't of his doing?
Correct. And he uses
Just a minute.
that analysis, but it does go into his investigation. He uses the reports from the lab throughout his investigation of the crime.
My point is that this document contains all of his findings and direct analyses except for the paint chip analysis?
The paint chip is from the lab and what she,
Okay.
Your Honor, I would disagree with him. I agree on the fact that, the paint chip analysis, but there is also eyewitness sightings, which again is hearsay. Those eyewitnesses can be brought forth and asked directly, so they had given an opportunity for direct and cross in court today.
So this document does contain...
More than one instance of
Let
hearsay,
me
yes.
finish. This document does contain information obtained from eyewitnesses and incorporated into this report?
may I respond? The only eyewitness that is mentioned in that, the only statements from an eyewitness that is mentioned in that document, the eyewitness that is mentioned, the statements who were made, that witness is going to be here in court today to testify. And that's the only witness that
Okay, I'll
he used.
withhold a ruling on admissibility. My inclination would be to admit it if they do bring that eyewitness in and suggest that the lab results on the paint chip would not necessarily be admitted by the court to be the proof, but if it led to his conclusions, I would entertain that. So this report would have a value limited to what he personally analyzed and found.
Your Honor, if I may.
But I'm withholding ruling on it anyway, but go ahead.
Under Midland's rule of law, it states that there are only 5 exceptions to hearsay. One is a written business record made in normal course of business. The lab results are not normal business records. This is an actual result of test performed. There's also excited utterance as well as president's impression, a written medical record made for the purpose of diagnosis or treatment as well. None of these apply to this, and therefore it is still hearsay.
I'm going to stay with my ruling, though. So I'm going to withhold admitting it. You'll have to re-offer it after you've put your eyewitness on that might correct it enough for its admissibility.
What did you do the day after you investigated the crime scene?
I went to the police impound and inspected the vehicle in question.
And whose vehicle was that?
It was J.J. Thompson's vehicle.
And what did you find upon examining the defendant's vehicle?
The piece of glass that I found on the scene was too small to be a puzzle piece fitted into the actual headlamp itself. There was no way to conclusively prove that the shard of glass came from that headlight. I noticed significant damage to the front grille and rear and right-hand panel of the car. Apparently this was due to a fender bender in the parking lot of the bar where J.J. Thompson was earlier. So that would account for the lack of physical evidence at the scene itself.
Were you given a police report that there was a fender bender?
I was told that by the chief of police, I believe.
And what else did you find upon inspecting the vehicle?
The paint chip likewise could not be directly linked to the car. However, it was similar in terms of color and chemically consistent.
And did you happen to notice the speed on Hickory Lane that evening when you were
I believe
examining
it
the
was
site?
25 miles an hour.
And what evening was this?
February the 8th, 2002.
No further questions at this time?
Mr. Braun, I'm Jake Gavich. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Start off, Mr. Braun, you're not a doctor, is that correct?
No.
Even though opposing counsel mentioned that you were a doctor.
Yes.
Okay. At this time, I would like to make a motion to the court that Mr. Braun is not a doctor.
The record will reflect his answer to your question.
Mr. Braun, you examined the vehicle. in question, which was the defendant's vehicle. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you had opportunity to observe the entirety of the vehicle.
That's correct.
In fact, you spent the entire evening scouring the vehicle for evidence to match it or tie it to the scene. Isn't that correct?
It was the morning, but yes, that's correct.
And you could find no evidence directly linking my client, J.J. Thompson, to this hit-and-run accident. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, you also mentioned that there was snow that evening. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And snow can damage the integrity of the evidence at the scene. Isn't that correct?
That's certainly correct.
And you were also upset that you were called rather late since the accident happened. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. I was called an hour after the accident occurred.
At 9:35 p.m. Isn't that correct?
That's when I arrived at the scene.
And the time of the accident was approximately around 8:40. Isn't that correct?
That's what I was informed.
And during this time, the evidence could have been tampered with or changed. Isn't that correct?
Objection, relevance. There's been no proof of tampering in this case.
I'm going to overrule the objection, and he can answer whether there was a possibility that the evidence could have been tampered with prior to his arrival on the scene. You can answer that question.
There's always a possibility of that.
And you also had paint chips that were found in the victim's clothing. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And that was not to be directly linked to my client's vehicle again. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
The piece of glass that was entered into evidence belongs to a whole family of SUVs. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Not just the Jeep Grand Cherokee, but a whole line of SUVs.
Sure.
And the Midland State Police were on the scene holding off this crime scene when you arrived. Isn't that correct?
Yeah.
And the Midland State Police have been notorious for following up scenes. Isn't that correct?
Objection, relevance to this case.
Your Honor, if I may. This is duly relevant. This man's...
Sustained.
Mr. Brown, you can't, with a degree of any certainty or professional certainty, link my client, J.J. Thompson, to the events that occurred on February 8th. Isn't that correct?
Scientifically, it's possible that it's likely that he was there, but there's no conclusive proof.
So that's a yes. You cannot directly link my client to the scene. Isn't that correct?
True.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Did the weather conditions affect your investigation at all?
No.
And opposing counsel talked about the paint. Why was that paint not directly linked to the defendant's vehicle?
Because it would be impossible to actually match the specimen of paint to the body of the car itself. It was not a large enough specimen.
What was the significance of those paint chips?
Objection is beyond scope.
May I respond?
Sustained.
And the headlight piece that opposing counsel mentioned, the glass, how did you draw conclusions about the defendant to that piece of glass?
Beyond the scope, Your Honor. I only asked
Wasn't
the...
any conclusions drawn on the sustained objection.
No further questions.
Thank you. Your Honor.
Very briefly. You don't know whether the snow actually affected your findings. Isn't that correct?
It didn't affect my findings in any way that I can tell.
So it's your testimony that all the evidence, that there was no possibility of any of the integrity of the evidence being altered.
Objection asked and answered.
I'll let him answer.
I was worried about it, yes, but when I arrived there, the main thing that snow would hinder in this type of investigation is the skid marks left by the vehicle, but they seem to be fairly intact.
Mr. Brown, those skid marks that you mentioned, you can't link them to my client, can you?
No.
No further questions.
Thank you. Your excuse.